so we have Julie Hamilton with us tonight. Julie's up there in the corner. Julie is a friend of mine. It's probably a little bit of a stretch to call us really friends. I mean, like, we haven't hung out a ton in life, but like, you all know how these kind of relationships go. Like, when you're in an intense part of your own life in school, very often you're surrounded by lots of people that have similar interests to you. Some of those people are kind of on the edges of your social circle, and you always kind of think, man, I would really like to get to know that person. They seem to be really interesting. And then you just never have time. But that's what the rest of your life is for. Yeah, these people come back around in different ways. And Julie and I have several things in common besides our love for Jesus. We have a love of cocktails, fine food, and 19th and 20th century European art. And Christina, who we had last week, and Julie were just two people that came to mind for me when I thought of, if I could just think of anybody to talk about the art that we have. Those are the two people that I would like to listen to more than anything else. So I'm glad that you guys are here, but really I'm glad for myself, because this is what's great about being in charge, is you get to invite the people that you've always wanted to listen talk about stuff. So so Julie has done she's a proper art historian, really, and she can talk a little bit about her background and her own kind of academic pursuits, but she spent a lot of time with Rouault. So like, she is the resident expert here, and so I thought it was really helpful, and really enjoyed Christina's talk last week, kind of more kind of big picture, how to approach kind of modernism in general as a Christian. But really, I'm happy that we have Julie here this week to talk a little bit more about Rouault in particular. So, Julie, do you want to introduce yourself in a little bit more, and then
Sure.
The floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction too. Also, you guys, I'm working with text here on my lap, so when I'm looking down, it's not that I'm not trying to engage with you guys. First of all, hello, I'm a fellow Texan. I grew up in Fort Worth. I relocated to the North Carolina area, which is when I was in school with Zach for graduate school. I live here with my partner and two middle school girls, which has been adventures in quarantine the last year. I went to Baylor University for my undergrad, and that is where I was introduced to Rouault, which I'll get into shortly. Christina, who spoke with you guys last week, we shared really similar classes and a similar mentor. So we were both in the Theology and the Arts program at Duke. But where we differ is that I ended up going the more art historical track instead of the theological track. And my interests in art history really are in contemporary art. First really started with Rouault and modernism, and it got into contemporary art, particularly how religious practices inform contemporary art and how contemporary art can help us ask spiritual questions. I'm really interested in how curators really create exhibits that teach us how to see instead of ostracize us and kind of make art more complicated. I'm interested in how exhibitions can actually translate work and kind of bridge the gap, I guess, between the work and yourself as a viewer. I'm currently the art editor for The Other Journal, which is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. My day job is roasting coffee here in Counterculture, so I got to stay caffeinated while I'm writing as much as I can. But I'm hoping to pursue my doctoral studies in art history and work in curation. It's the long game. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with you guys, and we can dive into some of this work. Give me just a second. I haven't really used Zoom that much over the last year. All right. Can you guys see okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I was originally introduced to Georges Rouault by my director, David Jeffrey at Baylor. And he was the philosopher Jacques Maritain's student, and Jacques Maritain was Rouault's best friend. So we'll kind of go back to Maritain because Maritain was really key in Rouault's conversion story and in his whole kind of faith development. But it was just so interesting to work with a person who had known Rouault's best friend. I feel like otherwise I may have not gotten introduced to him in the way that I did. When I was researching Rouault, I had the opportunity to go to New York and Paris to see his work in person and in the archives. He's quite prolific as an artist, and much of his work is not exhibited. It's actually in museum vaults and archives, and we'll kind of talk about why that's the case. But there's over 500 works that are at the museum in Paris that are just basically in storage. I was able to speak to Rouault's great-granddaughter and take a tour of his former studio. There's a picture of this right here. I did not obviously take this picture, but this is of his studio, which is now the foundation. I'm planning to rework parts of my thesis that I wrote to contribute. There's a conference next year that was originally supposed to be this year, celebrating the 150th anniversary of his birth, which was postponed due to COVID. But I think it will be an exciting point for some of these conversations to get revived. Some of what I'm going to say might be a tad ambitious, so Zach, keep me on time here. Feel free, raise a hand, interject, ask a question. But I thought it might be really helpful for you guys to have a larger framework for what you're looking at in the church and kind of just seeing how vast the amount of work was that he made, and not just the black and white work. Someone was mentioning that here just a little bit ago, of like most of the work that's in the church is black and white. And Rouault is actually quite known for his vivid color and texture. So it's important to think about both of those things together. Let me go here. Art history has had a difficult time categorizing Rouault, sometimes calling him an expressionist, like Vincent van Gogh here on the right, or a fauve, which means wild beast, like Matisse here in the middle, which refers to the different colors and shapes. In truth, he is neither per se. He occupies and transcends both styles. He's an outlier in art history, much like the figures that he spent his life painting. Rouault exists in a liminal space that has largely been ignored by major critics and curators, even though he was well received when he was alive. Sandra mentioned, if you were able to attend that talk, how the Miserere collection was one of the most important pieces of art in the 20th century, and how MoMA had an exhibition when it was released. I mean, the work went for the same amount of money as his contemporaries like Picasso and Matisse, but we don't hear of his name, especially in America right now. He was given a state funeral actually when he died, and it's interesting to note that when he lay in state, it was in the middle of a square between, on one hand, a Romanesque church, the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and on the other, across the street, the famous Café La Dumagno, which is where a lot of the French philosophers and Oscar Wilde used to hang out. And so even in Rouault's death or his funeral, he embodied the tension between the medieval and the modern world. I have been quite surprised that there hasn't been more of a revitalization of his work in the US. That is other than the Christian arts community, which is many thanks to Sandra and her generosity. Image Journal, there's an artist, Mako Fujimura, who has done a set of works that respond to Rouault's paintings. France, however, has had several major exhibitions on his work in the last probably decade or so, and he's definitely more of a household name. I think Rouault's theological vision was too explicit for modernist sensibilities, but the interesting point is that I think our postmodernist interpretations there is ample space to rethink about these things. Many art critics and curators are now wanting to ask religious questions because it brings about a particular point of view. What is someone's story? What is someone's background? What kind of faith informs the work that they do? There's a lot of interest in this now. What I find actually really interesting about Rouault is that the more we study a lot of artists, the more we're finding out how their biography some figures are quite problematic and we don't know what to do with them. They weren't necessarily the best people. And to maybe say in contemporary slang, Rouault was quite woke. He was very angry about how women were treated and painted. He championed the poor and the refugee. He was critical of colonist France, and he was scathing of a self-righteous church with no room for outcasts. I often think of Rouault as a visual companion to the writer Flannery O'Connor, if any of you have spent some time reading her. At first, they may seem like an odd pairing, a Southern American writer and a French painter, but there's a sort of Southern Gothic in Rouault's depiction of the grotesque, like O'Connor's descriptions. It's quite Augustinian, the reality of systemic sin weighing heavily on humanity, the macabre, the darkness being very dark, and it being a collection of misfits and outcasts. However, Rouault was a painter of phosphorescence and effusive color. His jewel-like color came directly from his knowledge as a medieval craftsman of stained glass. Just as stained glass windows rely on external light source to illuminate the images, Rouault creates a light source from within that emanates from his works, exuding towards the viewer. It's phenomenological, meaning it's happening to you. You experience the colors viscerally. You feel its presence. This is why I've been listening to the talks leading up to this one. It's so wonderful to hear people say what the work feels like in person, like being with the work, you experience something. Christina mentioned last week, she drew attention to the lead-like lines in the work that looks like the lead in stained glass. It's also one of the reasons that the East fell in love with Rouault's work, because the thick black lines resembled Japanese calligraphy and carried the zen of life in the lines. Someone was asking a question, I think, about Christ's eyes looking down and the kind of zen peace that Christ has in the midst of all the suffering, the kind of still point in the turning world. To me, this Zen aspect is really interesting. In some of his later work, there is a Japanese collector named Idemitsu who bought a large amount of Rouault's work, and his collection is in Tokyo. However, Rouault's early style, as you can see here, was much closer to Rembrandt's. As a student of Gustave Moreau, his style evolved as he encountered loss and began a religious quest to reconcile art and painting. His grandfather would take him to the Louvre on the weekends, and so he would look at the masters and study them, and was trained in academic painting. But one of the things that's interesting about this work here, he had entered it into a competition and lost, which he was not expecting. And this year is also the year that he is actually confirmed and received into the church. What's interesting about Rouault was part of his spiritual journey is when he was born. It was in the middle, actually, of a battle. Like, he was born into the basement, and some of the shells actually fell into the house. So it was a miracle that he wasn't killed. But he was not baptized immediately. And because there was an anti-clerical movement in France at the time that made his father really angry, he was a part of the Protestant church until he was older. So it is not until this painting here that he was received into the Catholic Church. But he didn't know what to do about art at the time because he's with this other group, the avant-garde painters that are trying to reconcile faith and art. And he was really angry about what was happening in culture around him, and he didn't understand why the church wasn't paying attention to what was happening. So it's at this point he leaves academic painting and he basically encounters the dark night of the soul. It is a descent into an inferno of the brutal, the ugly, and desperately laid bare forms. In Christina's talk, she mentioned to you the shift from academic painting for the elite buyer to portraying the everyday worker in modernism. This revolt of painting, as I just mentioned, became known as the avant-garde. It was a breakaway from painting myth and historical portraits and people of wealth to now looking at the working class, the poor, and the common person. His early work is intense, it is vivid, it is passionate. Employing India ink and gouache, there is a sense of urgency in his brushstrokes, applied quickly with an uncompromising vision. Curiously, these techniques are occurring at the same time he's asking these spiritual questions of, where is God in the midst of these things? Can I reconcile this in the church that I am a part of? He finds in this, especially this here, he meant this to be a triptych with Christ in the center and seeing Christ's face in the clown and the prostitutes. That there is a mask at play for all of us, the prostitutes, clowns, and judges, even the bourgeois. Whether it is makeup, self-importance, or hypocrisy, Rouault disdained social masks. He said, "Who doesn't wear a disguise? Just as the bourgeois could harbor great evil, so depravity could conceal the sublime." Here on these images, they're not on canvas, they're on paper, which is very interesting. Choosing paper as a medium allowed the image to be quite dense and create sheen as it would dry. But the use of paper is most curious in this painting on the left. It's double-sided. So the surface is transparent and it enables the viewer to literally see through the prostitutes, just like a stained glass window. Perhaps Rouault in his very form is showing you how to look at his subjects and see them as they actually are. With the clowns, there is a combination of watercolor, ink, and oil in a layered effect. The strokes of indigo ink are the definitive contours of the clown's face. As such, Rouault's very form conveys his means of revealing the true face of the human person. At the turn of the century, Rouault's subjects were poor and destitute. His admiration for Victor Hugo can only lead one to imagine his prostitute portraits as Fantine from Les Miserables. These figures here, other painters of his time, Toulouse-Lautrec and Degas, so same cast of characters portrayed differently. What is very different, and I'll turn to Rouault's portraits of prostitutes, is how these figures are represented. Rouault is not a voyeurist. The male gaze is not present. He is not a paying customer. He is not sleeping with his muse. His figures are all subjects. Rouault sees them as they are, oppressed by a broken political system. Rouault captures their humanity and their abuse. Rouault's great-granddaughter told me that there was never a monetary exchange between Rouault and the figures he rendered. He offered them warmth in exchange for a figure to study, making him drastically different from other artists of his era. He isn't relishing their vice and exalting it or sentimentalizing it, but he is aching for their broken and withered bodies. Age has not been kind to the forms that he shows us. Rather, his vision is empathic to their plight, and he's angry. In the novel Nana, Zola coined the term gutter Venuses for the prostitutes of the era, and I think that term is apt for what Rouault shows us. Especially here with this image, we see how she sees herself in the mirror, reflecting her as she truly is, as God sees her. Another character in early modernism and in Rouault's work is the clown. Also, Picasso portrays Toulouse-Lautrec, the Italian films of Federico Fellini. The clown is a commentary on class and the topsy-turvy economic structure of the circus. It is a kind of counter-society where theater gave acceptance to those that had no means of existing. The clown's job is to make people laugh, no matter what social status they are from. The clown is wholly concerned with the present, distracting people from their past or future. He is a welcome relief to the gravity of everyday life. The carnival, the circus, is the place where people could find freedom, equality, and abundance. In many ways, it substituted as the place of the church. It was the place of belonging. It offered a kind of family in the midst of a suffering world. Sandra mentioned to you that Rouault sat in on a legal trial for over a year. He painted convicts as well as judges, which the church at the time was complicit in. He understood the legal system analogous to the Pharisees from the Gospels, lacking mercy, humanity, imposing technicality and injustice on the lowly. His fierce criticism of power, money, and systemic oppression pervades his work. I now like to think of him as the 20th century's artistic Bernie Sanders, advocating for those that cannot speak for themselves. He diagnosed poverty as a moral problem, and he did so by portraying a grotesque vision as a kind of exorcist. I like to think of Rouault's surfaces as a kind of exorcism. Sometimes you see everything pulled right up to you, and sometimes you have to turn away, but then you turn back and you see what he's doing. So this was another one here, The Accused. I'm going to turn to the Miserere et Guerre series, which, if we're following the timeline, I've been showing you kind of his work leading up to this. So like, what was Rouault looking at in painting? What themes were in his work before he started working on this, especially because many of the pieces that are in this series are hanging in your parish right now. It spanned a great deal of time, and I won't go into it because Sandra talked to you about why that happened and about artistic licenseship and the wars happening. The majority of these were done in the 20s, and it was published in 1948, which is just kind of crazy how long it was before these were finished. But the kind of advent for this series is he lost his father, and his family had to flee Paris because of the war. And so he was thinking about his father's death. He was thinking about living in exile and really thinking about the Israelites in exile too, as he was looking at particular biblical passages and the presence of the war as he made work. The title of this cycle is drawn from David's Psalm, the penitential Psalm, from the Vulgate, the Miserere Mei, have mercy on me, O Lord, according to thy loving kindness. And so the Miserere connotes the series' prayerful and liturgical function. Guerre, the French word for war, has perhaps several pertinent interpretations. First concerns the era and time in which these prints were made between the wars and the deep effect they had on Rouault. Art historian Su-Young Kang, who's written this profound book on Rouault, if you're more interested in taking a deeper dive, said that Rouault found pity and grace in the deep furrow, in the trenches of suffering. Rouault saw suffering as participating in salvation, as Christ's suffering narrates God identifying with the downtrodden and the outcast. From the beginning, Rouault imagined this series as a type of devotional art, like icons you discussed with Christina. We may conclude that Rouault intended these images for liturgical use because of their contemplative and prayerful function. Because of their spiritual content, I consider these plates as a type of stations of the cross. In fact, the Église de Saint-Séverin in Paris's Latin Quarter has 10 plates of Rouault's Miserere cycle permanently displayed in a chapel as the stations along the walls of the church. I took these, goodness, probably about 11 years ago, but many that are up are ones we're going to look at and are in your parish now. Rouault punctuates his entire cycle of the Miserere with 5 plates using Veronica's veil. Veronica will appear in his work far more than Mary will, which is very interesting to me. But the name Veronica is the true icon, Vera Icona. She is the 6th of the 14 stations of the cross on the road to Calvary, who in an act of compassion knelt and wiped the face of Christ. The image of the holy countenance was left on the veil and was used to provide hope from the face filled with ultimate compassion. The Saint Face, or the holy countenance, is one of the most replicated images in Rouault's work. In the Catholic tradition, which I am from, which is also, Zach, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I feel like it's the same in Episcopal and Anglican traditions. Part of the Easter Triduum is baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist that culminates in the Easter Vigil. These 3 sacraments participate in the economy of salvation made possible by the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. Thus, beginning with the Easter Triduum and bringing in the new age of resurrection is the whole liturgical year with all its brilliance. So here with this plate, I see it as Maundy Thursday, the giving of the mandate by Christ to his disciples. Love one another as I have loved you, Christ says as he washes the feet of his disciples. This plate, which I noticed was brought up by someone, maybe it was even you, Zach, it is a resurrection scene. So this one is different from this one here. So, but I think this one's also in Sandra's collection. Here we see Mary and John the Beloved in agony, weeping at the left hand of Christ. On his right is Mary Magdalene, who appears to be in a state of reverent prayer. Instead of grieving outwardly, she is on her knees with hands folded. Next, we have Good Friday, the climax of Holy Week, as it anticipates the night vigil and administration of the church's sacraments to her new members and the resurrection of Christ in the midst of the dark night. So these are all images that I connect with Good Friday that are present in the Miserere cycle. As you can see from the different stations Rouault is pointing to from the biblical text. One thing that's interesting to me too to think about is that the images, as they look like stained glass windows, like what does a stained glass window look like at night? You can't see the image, you can't see the color. And so it looks like this grisaille black and white. So I feel like Rouault is even more so telling us, you know, this is kind of like the image of the vigil at night as we're awaiting dawn. Perhaps most poignant to this cycle, we sing the Agnus Dei, Jesus, Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us, the title of the series. There are 6 plates in Rouault's Miserere cycle that relate to the liturgy of Good Friday. First, we have Jesus Despied. Second, we have Veronica with her soft linen still walks the road. Next, we have, he was oppressed and was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. The bottom second one, Jesus will be in agony until the end of the world, which is actually a quote from Pascal. Next, the one I feel like you guys spent some time talking about, obedient unto death, even death on a cross, which is Station of the Cross, number 12. And the last one, finally, it is through his wounds that we are healed, which is the final image of the Miserere Eger cycle. Holy Saturday is the climax of Holy Week as it anticipates the night vigil, the administration of the Church's sacraments to her new members, and the resurrection of Christ in the midst of the dark night. The Paschal candle is lit and the lights darken for the recounting of salvific history. For it is only by the light of Christ that we may see the promise of the Old Testament fulfilled in Christ. It is a type of prayerful watch, not unlike what was being asked of the disciples by Christ on the night he was betrayed. We know that for Rouault, behind every shadow, there is a source of light. Within the vigil, the first two sacraments given are baptism and confirmation. I believe that the first one is depicted in Rouault's plate 30. We were baptized into Jesus Christ. We were baptized into his death, the exact liturgy of the sacrament of baptism within the vigil. Here we encounter a man standing contrapposto, hands folded, eyes downward, neck bent in humble submission. Next to Christ is St. John the Baptist pouring water over Christ's head. Simultaneously, a dove descends to hover as the miraculous act of grace and matter are sacramentally administered. Within this scene, we see not only baptism from the vigil, but also confirmation, the sending of the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove. The second sacrament given to catechumens is the Holy Eucharist, and that is the heart of Rouault's Miserere. The Word became flesh, one who was without sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. I think that Rouault finalizes this understanding of the Easter Vigil with his portrayal of the Madonna and Child. This is one of my favorite images of his. And one thing of note that's really interesting is that many of the Miserere plates he paints in color also. So he does the whole series, the suite, but many of the images he goes back to later on in his life, and he does a painted rendering of them. And it's really fun to look at them side by side because they couldn't be more unlike each other. Rouault has, as I said, very few works on Mary. The name here is Our Lady of the Ends of the Earth, which was the name of a Romanesque church in France, where Saint Veronica would have carried the relics of Mary and would eventually be buried herself. The church was completely covered by sand over time at the base of Land's End, so it was stretching out to the ocean, and it was not uncovered to the mid-1860s. I think Rouault is telling us when we have reached Land's End, she is the bridge of hope to Christ. So we may conclude that as night waits for dawn, so we look to you, O Christ. Easter Sunday does not appear in the Miserere. You have to wait for Rouault's later biblical landscapes and the work that he does after he finishes this to encounter a vision of resurrection. Yet hope permeates the monochrome work, holding light in the darkness. However, this is from the Passion series that is also in your exhibit. This is the Emmaus way. So he's still looking and thinking about the cycles of the life of Christ in other series he does. It's just not inside the Miserere. After the wars, Rouault's color is explosive. Paints Edenic pastorals, a new heaven and a new earth, where I think for Rouault, he imagined the manifestation of the wiping away every tear and death being no more. So I know I have put a lot in front of you guys to look at. I'd love to talk more about them or hear your questions, or if there are images you'd like to go back and look at a little closer. Wanted to kind of open the floor.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was incredible. Yeah, who has questions? You can, let me see. unmute yourselves if you need to. As always, I'm happy to ask my own.
Good. Go for it.
I am struck by this explosion of color, having experienced the display of the pictures, which was perfectly appropriate, I found in our sanctuary for the season of Lent. But these are much more elevating, as well as the one on the road to Emmaus. Was that typical of his work during the later part of his life?
It is, and that's a great question. I actually, when I was originally studying this, I kind of made a graph chart of looking at what colors he uses at different points of his life. And it's really interesting to me that in the early period, he's working with indigos and violets, which are the highest frequency. If you're thinking in like actual color and energy. Yellow and orange do not make an appearance in his work until after the Miserere. Like yellow doesn't exist at all, really. And so yellow and orange, I kind of saw it as the autumn of his life. And he does quite a few landscapes that he calls autumn landscapes. But there really is this kind of seasonality for him. The kind of angry period is his winter, this dark night of the soul. And then really after, and I guess I didn't get into it, his years of friendship with Jacques Maritain, this philosopher, really made him unite art and faith. And it really kind of came together instead of became compartmentalized. And really looking at his work visually, you can see this whole like transfiguration of his work as he grows into himself. And there's this peace that's there. And really, I think the Miserere is an extraordinary series, but to me, there's no comparison to his use of color. It's just, and he oftentimes would work squeezing it, especially when he was older, directly from the tube onto the canvas. And he worked with it flat. He didn't have it up on an easel. He had it flat on his tables. And they're so thick. Some of the last works that he made look like sculptures because they were inches thick of paint. He just like built them up until they were actually people, which is interesting. So yeah, the colors like that are definitely late in his mid to later parts of life.
Oh. I have a question and a kind of a comment from what I saw when I visited the church today. I did notice that the women that were depicted in his in the works that I saw, it was very straightforward. It wasn't like the women were not objectified. There wasn't like condescension towards the female figures. It was just very straightforward. And could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, you kind of touched on how he depicted women, but I'd be interested to hear more about that, especially considering how some of his contemporaries, just thinking like how Picasso often depicted women was in a wide variety of ways, but very different. Very different.
Sure. And it varies because there are so many different types of depictions. Are you thinking more because Rouault has contemporary figures for him in different lines of work? So he'll have the prostitute that we were just talking about. There is kind of the bourgeois elite that he's very critical of. He does not depict his wife ever, which I find really interesting. He's extremely private. He does not paint his family. That was not a part of his work, which is very much in contrast to other painters of the time that were always painting their muses, their current, partners. And, kind of it becomes interesting because looking at sometimes now when I look at work, I'm saying, okay, like, are you an object? Are you a subject? Like, what role are you playing as one being viewed and depicted. And then Rouault has other women, which would be the biblical figures. So like in this image right here that I have pulled up, the Claire de Lune scene, this landscape is pretty common in his late work. This image in particular is from his last book called Stella Vespertina. And the background image is a painting that he did for the ballet, The Prodigal Son, actually. He did costumes and a set design, which is really amazing. But the front figures is where he's going to start, looking at the Magdalene and the other women that followed Jesus. Like I said, Mary doesn't appear much in his work. There's a handful of works. It's really going to be the Veronica. That is his central female character. He'll have the prostitute and the Veronica. And what's interesting to me about that is, or let me see if I have different books that are pulled up here. How he has them in contrast of the true icon and basically kind of what is the image of the female for the Holy Countenance is really who I think he sees the Veronica as. But the way he depicts her is still going to be iconic. So it's in a worshipful way, like what Christina was talking about last week. He also paints Sarah, Abraham's wife, and really sees her as the prototype for Mary. And she has a flower tucked in her ear, which is really interesting because his figures of prostitutes will also have that. And so in many ways, I think he's wanting us to see them overlapping each other, of like, how do these biblical narratives inform the person I'm seeing in front of me, even if they are not beautiful? They are still redeemed, and wanting us to re-see the figure instead of, I don't know, I think too, because his contemporaries are so interested in women are either, it's the Madonna whore complex. So they're either a prostitute or they're Mary, or it's this other split between they are being objectified and dominated, or they become this kind of vampire, I'm forgetting the word right now, but like man-eater. Woman can't be a three-dimensional character and exist in modernist painting by men. It just, Rouault is one of the few people that gives us that.
It seems to me too, if I could
Thank you.
just
jump
in on that. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think that, so you tell me if you think this is fair, Julie, but it seems to me that you could also say that in the Miserere collection in particular, that the way he depicts women, he depicts them to look like Jesus. Like that, right. Right. We talked about this a little bit before, but there's one way to kind of complicate and dignify and give kind of three-dimensionality to women who were not often given that.
Right.
Is and a way to complicate the kind of Madonna whore dichotomy is to paint them as Jesus, but a suffering Jesus.
Right.
Not a extra holy Jesus. Go ahead, sorry.
No, you're good. I think that that's a great question and comparison, because in one hand, and I feel like for that time and place, it's kind of like what move you could make. It's like, okay, this is theologically like sound. We can do this. Like we can make this move to make, seeing the face of Christ and seeing the other, the female, has a place here, but it doesn't have its own autonomy as female. Like his women in that space are very masculine. Not, again, that's problem, but it's saying, what does difference look like? And how does difference not only be holy figures too? No, that's a great comment.
What else y'all got? about 5 minutes left or so.
I know we traversed through a lot of different things, and it's hard to just like pick a handful of images because there's so many paintings that are. Let me see. I could. Yeah, please go ahead.
I was just say I want to emphasize something you said. Just that you said that Rouault really intended for the Miserere series in particular to be devotional, or at least to be thought of as a kind of stations.
Yes.
And so, I mean, those of you who have come up here and see it, I think that even though we don't have the whole Miserere collection, you still get that effect, I think.
Yeah.
The ways in which the pieces exist in relation to one another. You know, I mean, I think that I keep thinking about the thing that I haven't really been able to shake as I've just been thinking about the series is Veronica's veil, and to hear you like expand on her importance to Rouault makes it all the more interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, the obvious question is like, well, how many times is it in the series? It's like 5 times or something.
Yeah.
And like, so the obvious question is like, why do you need to paint that thing 5 times? Like, it makes sense to have multiple pictures of Jesus, multiple pictures of maybe the crucifixion even, but if you're walking kind of from beginning to end and you're seeing all these pictures of Jesus, you're seeing all these pictures of prostitutes, clowns, kings, judges, pictures of Jesus, pictures of peasants, all kind of similarly rendered so that kind of these pictures of Jesus are blending into and blurring into these pictures of peasants and pictures, you know, I mean, this is the kind of theological argument that he's making, right? We see Christ in the face of the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And in that light, the Veronica's veil becomes the key to the whole thing, because, you know, I imagine it's almost describing, it is the vehicle for his theological argument. You know, you imagine taking a veil, like smashing it onto the wet paint of one of the images of Jesus.
Yes.
And then smashing that veil onto another canvas, and then you take it, you pull it away, and you have a picture of a peasant.
Right. So the Veronica is the artist for Rouault. Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
The role of the artist is, how do I receive something, whether that's an image, the muse, the Holy Spirit, and how do I represent it back as the Veronica, the Vera icon, the true icon. She's a mirror, right? And so as an artist, he's starting to see this symbiotic relationship between art and faith actually doing the exact same thing. It's incarnational. And so bringing inspiration into matter and paint is doing analogously the same thing as God becoming human.
And I mean, and Veronica, you never see actually Veronica, you just see her veil, right? Is there any
in the series? So Veronica shows up later. This is in his later work. He'll paint her quite a bit, and she's blue. So I remember when I was first looking at it, I was like, oh, this has got to be Mary. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I was like, we're not going with mom, we're going with the artisan. And that's, or just like, what does it mean to journey with Christ in the midst of suffering too? I think it's about being on the way. And what does it mean to make work in the middle of suffering? I feel like that's a question we can all ask ourselves. But yeah, Zach, you're right on the money with her presence in the role. I mean, like, you guys can see, this is something he does that's in the collection in Tokyo. He takes the Miserere plate and then he paints it.
Wow, that's incredible.
So the color it's extraordinary. The vividness, the humanity, it just gets really intense. And he reminds me a lot too, I know he didn't go into this, if any of you guys are familiar with Cézanne, he definitely has the kind of like Cézanne's texture and contour lines too. I'm trying to see if this book has the Veronica, maybe not. Anyone else? Are there, can you guys can see the kind of like texture that late paintings have, like photographs just don't do them justice at all. If any of you get a chance to go to the Pompidou in Paris, there's an entire room that they have devoted to Rouault, and it's all his late landscapes. I remember just my mouth fell open because I didn't know where to look first. The color just sang.
It's freaking so cool.
So a couple of more questions. I don't know if we have time, but a couple more things that you could touch on.
Yeah.
I think you alluded to the fact that a lot of his work is not displayed, that it's more in museum vaults, and I'd be curious to know why. And then I think you also mentioned he worked in stained glass. If I heard that correctly, did he actually work in that medium? Like, did he create stained glass? Because I mean, you definitely see it in the portraits.
Yeah. So he really inherited this from his father. I mean, he kind of talked about being his father being a kind of Joseph. He was a carpenter, and so he learned the old world medieval skills of repairing stained glass. It's actually how he worked and saved money for paints as a young boy so he could start painting. And some of the tasks he would have would be to repair windows that were broken in Paris. And so medieval glass, I mean, especially if it's Gothic glass, was made of very rare materials. So like the blue that's in Chartres that he got to work on was made of lapis lazuli. I mean, that's a semi-precious stone that, was crushed and baked into the glass. So Rouault fell in love with the rare and the expensive and the precious. And so he really sought those materials out in paint. But he did train first and foremost as a stained glass artisan. It doesn't really come back into his work till later. Later on in life, he gets a commission to do a stained glass window, and he does a window of the Veronica actually for a church in France. But the question you asked before that pertained to why his works aren't in exhibitions or why they're not exhibited. And I mean, I think there's multiple reasons why. I mean, I have yet to have an art history course where someone mentions his name, which is really interesting to me. But when I spoke with friends when I was in France, I was like, did you study, Rouault when you were in your art history class? And they're like, yeah, absolutely. So one, I think it's interesting the difference in American studies versus French studies of kind of where he's a household name. But for him to be as prolific as someone like, his contemporaries like Matisse and Picasso, and the value that Picasso sells for, this is where the difference is. It really comes after Rouault's passing, and the state inherits a good amount of his work. So part of it was the museums that had them, kind of put them into storage. Sandra mentioned that in the fight over the artistic licensing that he wasn't able to complete hundreds of his works, and then he publicly burned them. That's kind of an interesting character, which I kind of love. It's like,
yeah, really
complete, and they won't be true if I don't finish them. So I'm not going to let them, be released to the public.
Sounds like something Bernie Sanders would do.
Exactly. The first Rouault painting I saw in person, I should have pulled this up here. It was at MoMA, and it's Christ Mocked by Soldiers. It was one of Karl Barth's favorite paintings, actually. And when I went back to look at it, I said, when was the last time this has been out on the floor? And they said, oh, it was in the middle of the 70s. And I was like, what are you talking about? Hanging here. I think, one answer that isn't related to theology actually comes down to a conservation issue. His work is so thick, and some of it didn't dry properly, that it has cracked. There's this really amazing Christ mocked by, no, what is it? Oh, it's called The Flagellation, that's in Dallas. The DMA has it. And I asked them, I was like, why isn't this out on display? And they're like, the whole thing's cracked. Like we can't stabilize it for it to not actually disintegrate more. And so we have to store it back here. So some of that is just from the materials, but it really is a much, having to do with how modern art was not interested in, I wouldn't say religion, they're not interested in Christianity. And Rouault is really as explicitly Catholic as it gets. Like, he's like, here it is, right in your face. Like, there's no way around this. Like, you're either going to deal with it and you hold this as true, or you don't. And for him, it really is kind of I take it or leave it. This is my faith, and I make no apologies about it. And what's fascinating is I have some colleagues that have been working in London in conversations in theology and art, and museums are very interested in religious work, especially Christian work now, because there's been this kind of time to kind of say, oh, well, we actually aren't atheists, and we really are interested in these work from particular vantage points. So I'm very encouraged that there is a space now to think about these works. But I mean, yeah, the reason that this hasn't been talked about is because he's a Christian is really what it comes down to. Even though we can go back to like the Renaissance, I mean, we can go back to art that was, commissioned by the church. Everyone's okay with that. But if it's dealing with modern art, it's not okay. But what's interesting to me is there's so much room to explore his work that I think would be really attractive. He does this whole series on racial issues, just like being really critical. Did I lose you guys?
That was me. No, sorry.
Okay. Wait, are you there? I
just stopped your screen share. Yeah.
You're fine. Being really critical of France's presence in Africa, and looking at colonialism and looking at all of these questions that, kind of modern art really hasn't reconciled from that period yet. I mean, people still love Gauguin, and Gauguin's like one of the most terrible painters of those things that there can be. So when it comes to like questions now we're asking is the responsibility of the artist. Like, how much are we interested in like someone's life if they were a good person? Well, we care about that now. It matters. So I'm hoping that there's more space to talk about some of the work he did, because he was holding people accountable and he didn't apologize for it.
Super, super interesting. I would like to talk about that a lot more. But anyway, so we need to wrap things up here, but I need to have a couple of important things to say to just kind of tie a bow on this. One is, this is going to be our last session. We were originally planned to go one more Wednesday, but I just decided we're going to call it this week. I've felt really great about where we've been, but the plan for next week was for me to talk, and y'all are just so tired of me by now. So we're just gonna call it tonight. So so this has been super fun. Second is just a thank you to Julie. I have such a heart and appreciation for thoughtful art historians, and specifically Christian art historians. It is like we depend on people like Julie to keep the saints of the church alive. And you can see, I mean, I think Rouault is a great example of somebody who is slipping through the cracks of the art historical consciousness, especially in this country. And it has a lot to do with the fact that he was a Christian. And so we have people like Julie who are keeping those saints of our church alive so that we can continue to be in communion with those who went and died before us, and we can come. And I mean, I hope even this conversation tonight, especially this conversation tonight, gives you more texture to want to come back again and then be in more conversation with this artist as he tries to challenge you and challenge us for our own priorities and our own spiritual lives for the church today. So just a special thank you for Julie in particular, but an appreciation for Julies in general, as many of there are out there. And then last, I have a surprise for you all. I know a few people had to jump off early, so it's their loss that they're going to miss this. But the surprise is that with Sandra's help, we actually, as a church, bought one of the pieces that we are now having, that's now on the wall. Not the one that's on the wall, but we bought another copy of it, and it's this one right here.
Oh my
Wow.
And so Sandra helped us buy it for some idiot was selling it. So it's now ours. We're kind of slowly building out the St. Mark's permanent collection. And so we have this, it's now framed. Christy picked it up today. And so it's going to be, I think right now it's going to be a Lenten piece for us. It'll come out every Lent and help us. And I think something I've been trying to think of is what will be the emblems, the artifacts of this bananas year that we've been, and this conversation has been a really helpful one for me in particular, me personally. So this will be one of our artifacts that we carry forward with us. So I'm really excited about that. And
I'm jealous.
Well, okay, so that's it. Thanks, y'all. This is super fun. And
Thank you guys for having me.
thank you for being here, Julie. I should say, Julie, this is the part of the conversation when we're in person that we all get to clap for you, and then you feel affirmed and good. But on Zoom, it just never feels as good. But just know how deeply we appreciate you and are grateful for what you share with us tonight.
Thank you guys so much. I mean, it's encouraging to me to see churches still buying art and like supporting people like myself to, do what we do, and we love it, and we know it's a vocation and get to share it with other people. So we feel split sometimes, in the world, the gallery, the academy, the church, and we don't get to put the parts of ourselves together. So thank you for letting me do that.
Lovely. All right, y'all. Well, I'll see you later. Julie, you stay on just for 1 second while everybody else leaves, and then see y'all later.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.